We've brought together this conversation today between me and my colleagues, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, because we think that it's increasingly important for sociologists to find ways to engage in a meaningful way in public discussion, public debate. So what we've done is bring together people who can talk on the basis of their own experience about trying to make sociology matter outside those beautifully nice boundaries of paywalled journal articles. My overriding concern as the managing editor of the Sociological Review is to really think about new ways of making sociology matter. This really isn't a how-to session. It's more a set of reflections on the prospects and challenges for doing this. I'm really pleased that the Sociological Review are organising this in conjunction with Discover Society, which, if you don't know about Discover Society, I suggest you go and have a look at this online platform that really is trying to find ways of communicating sociological knowledge in a way that is open to a much broader audience than we would normally communicate to through journal articles. And I'm also very pleased to bring the director of Discover Society, Professor Gurminder Bhambre, who is Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies at the University of Sussex, and who's also responsible for the Global Social Theory website, which I think is a fantastic online resource that really is trying to change the shape of what we have assumed is the sociological canon and moving it away from the white Western hegemony that is an overarching theme within the sociology that we know today. And I'm also joined by our current Sociological Review Fellow, Dr. Luc de Noronha, who, alongside his PhD research, which was about the deportation of Jamaican British men, did a series of podcasts called Deportation Discs, which he also then folded into a brilliant exhibition that he showed down at UCL in autumn last year. So I wanted to start by asking both of you about your own interventions into making sociology matter. So I'm going to start, Luc, if you want to tell us a little bit about Deportation Discs, that would be great.
Can everyone hear me okay? Am I mic'd? No. I'll just try and speak up. Speak up a bit. Yeah, okay, cool. Deportation Discs. I can try. Maybe actually, that might make me. Yeah. Cool. So you can hear me now a bit more? Cool. So Deportation Discs was, if people have listened to Desert Island Discs, I don't know if people have heard this. I mean, it's a BBC Radio 4 programme where famous people give a kind of story of their lives through the soundtrack, through 8 songs, and then a favourite book and a luxury item. And so everyone's been on it, including kind of Theresa May, but also Stuart Hall. So there's a big range, but usually people who've been very widely recognised for their kind of for their achievements. And my idea was to do that with people who'd been deported to Jamaica, so they really had been banished to an island. Although one that we consider paradise in tourist brochures, and to give their songs, to give their 8 songs and tell their story. And so that's the format. It's a little longer than the Radio 4 version, but the idea, I guess, was that I was writing kind of ethnographic portraits on young men's lives who'd been deported, who'd grown up in the UK, and been criminalised in the UK. And I wanted to tell those stories, that form of portraiture, with sound, especially given that the men I was getting to know were listening to a lot of music and were very reflective about the music they listened to at each stage. So it worked really well. There's currently 2 online, but another 2 that I'm editing. And that was probably, I mean, that's one of the things. And then there's also, I suppose, way before publishing in an academic journal, which is much, much harder than writing short things online. It was my attempt to share the research in progress. So whether on Discover Society was one of the first places, but also wherever else would publish what I wanted to write. And that was, so for me, the order was rather than publishing beyond the academic journal, it was more the process of trying to write shorter things in an academic voice, and one that's accessible, helped me to have confidence that if I got a bad academic journal comment back, that maybe that wasn't the only way to value the kind of research that I was doing. So yeah, there was a lot of public short writing and then the podcast, which came before full publication.
I think that those ways of experimenting with using those public fora for kind of engaging the work as it's in progress are really, really useful. I've been doing a series of podcasts from my own project, which is about British people who live in the EU27 and Brexit. And it's been a really, really valuable way, actually, of thinking about how you consolidate down a set of ideas and how you then communicate those to people who aren't your ordinary sociological audience of a journal article. And I think it's helped me to also express myself better when I come and give a conference paper. I'm no longer daunted by a 20-minute presentation and how to compress 8,000 words into 20 minutes. So I think that's also really useful in terms of helping you with the writing process. So there can be something in it for you as well. Gurminder, I thought I would turn over to you because your project with Discover Society is really exciting, but it's also quite a large project, quite different to you just talking about, using that as a way of communicating your own research.
So Discover Society was set up about 6 years ago now, and it was really an idea that John Homewood had to provide a platform for the sharing of research, because one of the things that we noticed around that time was that a lot of people had individual blogs and a lot of people were beginning to write things for a more general audience, but it wasn't clear how they were being communicated more broadly. So unless you went to somebody's blog, you wouldn't necessarily find it. So the idea with Discover Society was really to provide a platform for it to be like a collaborative blog. So it was really not something that was drawn out of our own research, but thinking about how could we intervene within public debates, especially given the fact that newspapers and media more generally didn't seem to be that interested in having academic voices straightforwardly appear in these sorts of programs, and yet academics were doing the research that was necessary for thinking about the issues that we needed to think about. And so what could we do about it? So in that sense, Discover Society was really set up with that aim, to provide a platform for academics to be able to communicate their research to a broader audience. We have a fixed format. We drew inspiration from New Society, if anybody remembers the sort of magazine that used to come out in the 60s and 70s called New Society, and communicated sociological research to a broader audience. So we updated it, we made it online, it's open access, and we have 14 articles published once a month, every month. And the idea also was to not constantly be updating the articles, because often you have on websites that it's about the new, what's the newest piece that's just come up. And we wanted to have it be a magazine. And so it was a magazine format, that you had an issue every month, and for a month we would disseminate those articles. We'd try and send them out on email lists, and we would also tweet these articles. So I think a lot of the ways in which the work gets disseminated is through Twitter, is through online sort of venues and so on. And that's enabled us to reach quite a global audience. Yes, I don't know, do you want me to say more or?
I think I was just going to ask you both about who the audience is for your interventions, because I think that that's always an important starting point. Whenever we start to engage in these new modes of communication, because of course we all know who the audience is for an academic journal article. It's perhaps students if we're really fortunate, but normally it's our academic peers. And engaging in another mode of communicating sociological knowledge might mean that we have to think differently about who our audience is. So who did you have in mind with Discover Society?
I think we thought that to intervene in public debate, so the informed reader, if you want to put it that way, that somebody who was interested in the politics of our time, somebody who was interested in making sense of the inequalities that were shaping society, and somebody who wanted to know more about this, and wanted to know more about it than simply the opinion pieces in newspapers and so on, but to read research that was informed, that was rigorous, and that was considered. And so in that sense, I think we had this idea that it would be an intervention into public debates. How could we intervene in particular topics that were arising at the time? And we often tried that if there is a news event that's happening, to get people to write about it from their own expertise in order to provide an easy digest to be able to understand those sorts of issues. So I think the audience tends to be mostly within Britain, but there is a significant readership more globally as well, in part because of Twitter and being able to disseminate it throughout the 24-hour cycle. You catch people in different time zones. So that was also something that was important to sort of get a sense of, that we weren't simply sending tweets out during our waking hours, but if we sent tweets out on a 24-hour cycle, then you were getting people who were awake at different times. And that might seem like a really basic sort of insight, but until we'd thought about it, we hadn't thought about it.
I think all of those processes of production and the thought that goes into the production of those things are really important. Luke, who were your audience?
At first, I guess I wasn't really thinking so clearly about who the audience was. It was quite cool as a PhD student to be writing something that gets anyone to read it. But over time, I guess I think more, there's still students, people in the academy. Interestingly, when my journal article finally came out, when I was able to get one out, then quite a few people off Twitter messaged me or emailed me to ask if I could send them a copy. So then somehow doing the other thing first meant that people read an academic journal article who would not normally have had access. So that was nice. And so there are some interested readers who would stick with an 8,000 to 10,000 word article. But for me, I guess shorter, snappier pieces are useful for kind of public interventions into political debates. So informed readers, but also, for example, activists, particularly people working against borders for my work, anti-racists, young people. So, for example, one of the places where I've had some reception or been invited to talk is Consented magazine, which is this is very British heavy, but it's a London-based kind of young person's education, public lectures on a Sunday kind of thing. And Gurminder has spoken there as well. And it's that kind of place where anti-racist academics are finding groups of young people between the ages of 15 or teachers who are interested in hearing what we might try and tell them. Who else? I guess people who are involved in policy coming from the left of that. So, for example, the World Transformed is a conference that happens simultaneous to the Labour conference, kind of momentum heavy, and they have been engaged with doing a panel session on criminalisation and on borders and talking about the figure of the foreign criminal. So I would say that that's an audience I've realised more recently is there, and when there's enough people thinking, oh wait, let's not play into a good migrant, bad migrant thing because one of the many things that helped me think about this was a podcast, then that for me is the way in which things spread. So the audience is not only the number of people who retweet. Apparently, I read as well that 92% of interactions with tweets come in the first hour. So we're also chasing the wrong thing if we're trying to think about that all the time. I think about Les Back's work in The Art of Listening, where he talks about sociology being about slowness and about a craft. So we should retain that as well and not get too stuck in the metrics, which aren't disconnected from impact and ref. But I would say you can't exactly tell who the audience will be or where it will travel, but you only see after a while that, that's one small part of a broader conversation which can't be measured, but which is, some young people going to shout outside a detention centre or something as important as that.
I think that's a really good kind of overview of the prospects for making sociological work travel in different ways. But I was surprised that you didn't mention the people who'd actually taken part in your research as one of the potential audiences, because I think they were.
Yeah, I forgot about that. I got wrapped up in the World Transformed. So the deportation discs thing was cool because I've done two with a person called Chris and a person called Danico, and Chris said his sister listened to that and that's the most she ever heard about. She ever knew about his criminalisation, immigration case and deportation. So, that's kind of staggering and a measure of how people don't communicate or find it difficult to communicate. But it was important for those individuals to be able to hear a podcast form and for that to make sense to them in the same way that the music does, rather than necessarily the thesis. So when I did give them a thesis, Danico did kind of have a picture with it and was like, put it on his WhatsApp or something as proud of being involved in this thing, but I doubt he's going to read it all. It's 100,000 words. He might do, and Chris might do, but the point is that the book does a particular thing to say, this is what came of all of this time we spent hanging out, and this was the point. But then the podcast travels in a different way, and a way that's more current, not just for the kind of commuters, but for people who listen to things on their phones all the time. So yeah, that was definitely a really important aspect of doing it that way. Thanks for reminding me.
I think one of the key themes is to do with immediacy, and that's certainly something that you have been doing at Discover Society. And I think there's a politics to that, though, isn't there?
What sense?
The political ambition.
Well, I mean, we wanted Discover Society to be a platform for the dissemination of research that academics had done, oriented to intervening in public debates, but also policy issues that were live at the time. So one of the things that we did at one point, I mean, the next month's issue actually is going to be a special issue oriented to the review that's currently going on around the PREVENT agenda. And so PREVENT, for those of you who don't know, is a counter-extremism programme that's being implemented by the British government at the moment, and it's come up for an independent review. And so one of the things that we've done is pull together people who are engaged in researching that agenda from critical perspectives particularly, to put together contributions which will ultimately be fed into the review of PREVENT. And so that becomes a way of gathering together the work that's being done and hopefully amplifying it in that sense, because again, individual voices can often get lost, but if we make these interventions collaboratively, then they have a greater resonance within those sorts of debates, and so hopefully would have an impact. And we know that they do have an impact, even if it's much slower. So it's not necessarily that government ministers are going to change their minds because of what's published in Discover Society, but at least people can't say that they didn't know what this agenda was about, in part because it's there, it's being researched, it's being talked about, it's being disseminated, and it's contributing to and shaping public debates in that way. And I just wanted to add also, one of the other constituencies who read and engage with Discover Society are teachers. And teachers, again, not just in Britain, but around the world. There's a school in the West Indies called Walmersby who retweet our stuff constantly and write to us telling us that they use it within their teaching materials and so on. So in part because these pieces are short, they're accessibly written, but dealing with complex and contemporary sociological issues, it becomes a great resource for people to be able to use in teaching as well.
I think that's a really good example of how to do public sociology in a way which isn't about the individual public sociologist, which I think sometimes we can get a little bit too caught up in our own academic careers and what this might do for us as individual academics, and forget that broader collective project that I hope that we're all signed up to. Luke, for you, what's the politics behind what you've been doing? What's been driving that?
I guess I go back to the point about all of the audiences which I realise emerge, which is, I guess, putting something out there with others. So it's not about me having the hot take that needs to be. And it can become that. Twitter makes it feel like that sometimes. Like, you know, people are searching for attention, including journals, among the people scrolling through a timeline. But I suppose it would be, the politics of it would be sharing and distributing the things that you get from being given a bit of money to sit in a room for 4 hours and read a lot and spend a lot of time with people, and trying to get that out so that other people feel like it helps them understand some of the things that are going on around them. So I guess the politics of it are that, for me, the academy always feels like quite an unnatural place to talk about things like deportation. I mean, it seems very strange that you would go to Jamaica, meet people who've been heavily criminalised, are now destitute, and who get demonised at every turn in the press and among kind of mainstream NGOs, and then to return and then to just think about that as something that needs to be refined purely theoretically, so it's the best monograph or the best journal article in the highest impact or most impressive form. So I guess, yeah, the politics of it are still the same as they were that first time that I wanted to write something, because I thought there's something going on that people are talking about, whether that's Brexit, whether that's a particular deportation case, whether that's a protest outside the Isleworth Immigration Removal Centre. And I feel like there's something that someone told me, who most people don't know anything about, that might be useful. And that impulse is still the same, and it's still one that says, I suppose, reframing it the other way around, for me the journal feels awkward and strange, and thinking about it in that way for me feels not connected to the point of it. So the politics is trying to keep the rigour, keep the slowness, and keep the kind of communal sense of reviewing and reading one another's work and spending a lot of time in libraries and bringing that out into a world of people who are, trying to work stuff out.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of thinking about how you move that knowledge out of that paywalled space in lots of ways. I just wondered if I could push you both a little bit more on asking a question about what your interventions have opened up in terms of the production and communication of knowledge.
I mean, so we've talked quite a lot about Discover Society. I might say something about the Global Social Theory site. That was set up around the same sort of time, so about 5 years ago. And that was partly when there were student movements around why is my curriculum white, the sort of arguments around decolonising the university were beginning to emerge and so on. And having taught in social theory programmes, I was aware of what the social theory curriculum standardly looks like. And I was also aware that no matter how many changes I might make individually to the teaching that I was doing, that there were also a lot of other people teaching these courses around the country. And having spoken to colleagues about how we might transform these modules, it was always, one of the comments was always, well, I don't know who else is out there. I haven't got time to do the research and put new people onto my curriculums, my modules, and so on. So I thought, well, why not just produce a free resource that would provide access, which would provide short entries on people who we could think of as social theorists who come from places other than Europe and North America. And so came up with this idea of the Global Social Theory website. There are 3 sort of categories to it: thinkers, topics, and concepts. The thinkers page is the most developed, and we have a whole range of thinkers. As much, I mean, I would like to say absolutely from around the world, but again, we rely on people contributing to help update that. So we do have more people from sort of African Americans, from the Caribbean, from Asia, not so many from Africa, not so many from the Far East, not so many from the Pacific, and so on. But it's an open collaborative website. So if anybody sees omissions or glaring gaps, then all you need to do is email me and I'll happily put up an entry that you send. And that's been really good because in a way, I mean, every autumn we tweet out and sort of say, if you're updating your module handbooks, have a look at the site, see how you can, even just including the link to the site, even if you're not going to include a new thinker within your module, if you include the link to the site, then your students become aware that there are other people and they can do the research themselves and so on. So I think that's been a really positive intervention because it takes seriously the nature of the arguments that are being made about students about what they want from their modules and their curricula, and it provides a resource for people to be able to at least make some effort to address it, even if they're not going to radically overhaul the module outline as a whole.
Luke, do you have some kind of further thoughts on what it's opened up for you, this kind of sociological intervention?
Not really.
Not really?
I can try. I guess for me the thing that happened over my PhD was that my work became more relevant, and that's part of why there was several audiences. When I started, we hadn't voted to leave the European Union. There'd been no one's heard of the Windrush scandal. So now when I mention that my work's about deportation to Jamaica, then people are like, well, I know what that is. If I can do anything even slightly useful, it's join with a bunch of other radical anti-racist activists and academics who would say the Windrush scandal is not just about a particular small subsection of deserving real citizens as against the innumerable illegal immigrants, but that people are illegalized by immigration law. And here's some stories of people who or their family have British passports and they don't, and this is the trajectory, both legal and kind of through their experiences through which that happened. And I think there are other people who may have done that, and I think that it's an obvious response from someone who thinks in a certain way about what the problem is. But it was useful to have the resources from the academy, from an ESRC funded PhD, and to then be able to think about how to get them into useful places. And I think that leads to also, I really agree with Kaminder's original point, which was that mainstream media doesn't seem to really care about academic research a lot of the time. I mean, The Guardian were nowhere interested in any of the things I tried to send them for a while. And then the Windrush happened, and suddenly you can say something quite radical because they just need content to get people to click on a thing that says Windrush at a specific 48 hours. And that can be useful. It can open up things. It can get people aware of what you're doing. And it can get them to play deportation discs at a thing for the world transformed. And that's really great. And that's kind of fortune in terms of the personal relevance of someone's academic work, especially at PhD level. But I think there's a kind of thing that can be replicated there, which is seeing where you can use the resources that you get from the institution and kind of intervene intelligently and sharply to say something or to feed the people who are writing short pieces in the media if you can't get in there yourself.
I think along with that, sometimes when we're intervening in those types of spaces, there's also a need to understand the processes through which those spaces operate as well, which I think, we can have a very simplistic idea about how the media works, but as soon as you start to kind of open up and try to find ways in yourself, you start to realise how, it's as complicated as the processes through which academic publishing takes place, I think, in lots of ways, and learning that becomes part of the project of moving sociology out there in lots of ways. Before we open up to the audience, I wondered if I could just perhaps ask you both to reflect on the kind of what you've learned, what your kind of key lesson has been from engaging in these sociological interventions, kind of making sociology matter, and maybe a little bit about the challenges that you've faced as well.
Getting people to produce summaries of their work for Discover Society, because Discover Society, as I said, it's an online magazine. We ask for contributions of no more than 1,500 words, and for them to be written with the general audience, informed reader in mind, which means no references, writing in an accessible way, simplifying complex concepts, not to take the complexity out of it, but to make the complexity more easily understood and digested. And that's quite a task. And so in a sense, that's a skill in its own terms. It's not something that can just be done off the bat necessarily, but might require a couple of revisions to do and so on. And so that's been quite interesting to see the ways in which people engage with that process and are open to doing it and are willing to do that. I think one of the sort of most interesting things has been the fact that, in part because the strapline of Discover Society is measured, critical and engaged, and we haven't had the sort of trolling that you sometimes find in other venues. And so the comments that generally are put under articles are usually engagements with the articles and are constructive in most instances and so on. But we do manage the comments, so it's not a free-for-all. They have to be moderated and so on. But that was one thing that I was quite surprised by, that there was a very reasonable discussion that goes on below the line on Discover Society. And so in that sense, I guess there's an aspect that people are interested in this, because it's not just academics who click through the links. It does seem to be a wider audience who are engaging. But the question is always, how can we push it out further? And how can we engage more broadly? And those, I think, are always challenges when you're working from within an academic context to sort of push at those boundaries and try and get a bigger audience. It's not always easy or straightforward in terms of how one does that. So I guess that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think I've fallen foul of that situation where I think to myself, I'll write a quick blog post. I'll give myself X number of hours, and then realizing actually that to craft something like this is a really specific skill. And if you're really serious about engaging a broader public in your work, then actually spending the time to do that. And I know that's something that the digital team at the Sociological Review have been working very closely with authors on, in terms of producing the blog posts that we put up on our site as well. Luke, what about for you, some kind of lessons and challenges?
I think the point I made earlier about trying to retain what's good about the academy in terms of the slowness, a rigour, spending a lot of time in libraries, because I guess I've not had any other kind of academic career. I started my PhD and got a Twitter account, for example. I have finished my PhD last year, and so for me it's always been, it was hard to think about today because they've never felt like distinct parts of the work that I've been doing for not that long. But I guess I would say, and I've just been reading the beginning of a book called The Twittering Machine by Richard Seymour, and it's quite scary, but so it does make me feel cautious about, in terms of one of the things I've learned, or one of the problems, is to also think too much on Twitter and work too quickly with that, and to think therefore to somehow retain the slowness and the sharpness of an intervention, because there's something annoying and slow about a journal article that no one will read anyway, but there's also something dangerous about trying to always be there with the sharpest, or to write that blog in 2 hours. I've tried that as well, and then you realise actually I should have spent a bit more time thinking, which is the whole thing we're supposed to be training, but also we're part of the world that is moving very fast and in which people are competing for attention. So I would say the thing I've learned is maybe to use Twitter less, basically, in the last 2 years, to try and retain a slowness, but also to realise that things will go somewhere if they're relevant, because people do care and people are out there doing stuff, and those different audiences can speak to each other more easily now. And that's what we're aiming for, and you probably won't know until a few years down the line that you've done something that was, or been part of something that was moving. So I think that would be it. Sorry to be negative about Twitter. I've just been reading this book.
I actually think that's probably quite a good note to draw our discussion to a close a little bit. And as somebody who was an academic before Twitter, I really do relate to those kind of ideas about how it can artificially give us a sense that our work is moving, when actually Twitter is a very specific type of public space, which, obviously as a sociological review, we're very engaged with all of these social media platforms, but for particular purposes of pushing out that sharp, informed, sociological work that is told in a way that a broader audience can engage with.